Okay, we should be live again. Can you hear me this time? Please say yes. Hold up, let me mute it over here because I have the chat going. Okay, all right. Figured out what was going on. It's this stupid thing that was recording my voice instead of Chrome, but now it's working. Okay, let's start over. Shall we? So it is very snowy outside. You guys are all saying yes, so I'm going to take that as a sign to keep going. Now, this lecture is really going to be a follow-up to what we talked about last time when we talked about the scientific revolution. We talked about the Enlightenment, and more specifically, we talked about that transition right after 1648, when we talked about how, you know, through the guise of the scientific revolution, how we trends and sort of the rediscovery of this old knowledge thanks to the printing press and sort of that allowed this sort of free-for-all of knowledge for sort of the general public. And as there was more wealth available in society, there was more sort of disposable income that could get funneled into the sciences. And because it could get funneled into the sciences, you ended up having this big funding of discovery and research for the first time, specifically going to these individuals. And remember what I said, they refer to themselves not so much as scientists, because that's what we call them, but they refer to themselves as natural philosophers, as these people trying to discover, let's call it the mysteries of nature, right? And, you know, using the scientific method, using the rediscovery of logic in particular, they sort of create these arguments and a method through which they study the world. And that, you know, they run into all sorts of problems. That's for last class. For this class, though, we're going to be talking about the Enlightenment. Sorry, not the Enlightenment. The effects of the Enlightenment politically. Because if you guys remember, the big change was from the scientific revolution to the Enlightenment, using those same techniques that the scientific revolution used to study people, to study society, to study how we behave in our everyday lives. And you sort of get this first rejection already of, let's just call it Hobbesianism, this idea that, you know, people are bad and nasty and we need a big, powerful government to keep us in check. Is that that's not necessarily the case. That, you know, there is more to government than just control and quiet. Now, in they start the effects specifically in 1776. We talked a little bit about the English Revolution, but the English Revolution is not a fully like product of the Enlightenment. That's more of a product of what happens at more than of anything else. The English Revolution kills the monarch, but doesn't replace the monarchy. There is still a monarch of England. All it does is it says, we do not like this monarch in particular, this person bad, and therefore we will replace that person. That's not what happens in America, and as we're going to see next week, hopefully, if it doesn't snow again, in France. Now, in order to understand both the American and French revolutions, you need to understand that they both sort of have the same core starting event. And that event is the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War is the big war of the post-Westphalian age. It's the first big war after 1648, after countries get together and decide that states are a thing. Now, this war, the 7 Years' War, so-called because it did not last 7 years, because historians are great, is not a bloody war. It's not a war it's not like the 30 Years' War or the World Wars that are, tremendously destructive in terms of lives lost. What it is, however, is expensive. It is an expensive war for two big reasons. Firstly, it's the first global war. It is the first war fought on a global level because for the first time, every European country has colonies. And so it's not just fought in Europe. These wars are fought in the Americas. They're fought in sub-Saharan Africa. They're fought on trade routes along the Indian Ocean. They are fought global. World expensive 1900s. Can you imagine how expensive they are in the 1700s when you have to sort of logistically manage fleets of wooden ships going across the world trying to fight your enemies? It's expensive. It's a logistical nightmare. So that's the first reason. And the second reason is that it's the first war of what we're going to call the transition. The period between some states are still states. And can I repeat what I just said? Okay, so 7 Years' War is really expensive because, firstly, it's a global war. It is a war fought pretty much all over the world because, unlike prior wars, every country has colonies now. So Spain's got colonies, England's got colonies, France has got colonies. Everybody has overseas territory that they're managing. And so when they get into war, all of their colonies go to war with them. So it's not England versus France, state versus kingdom. It's the 13 colonies that are going to become the United States. It's Canada versus Quebec. It's all of these colonies fighting with each other, managed by the motherlands. And because of that, a world war is expensive enough when it's happening in modern times. Imagine how much more expensive a world war is if your wooden ship, just internet available as a guy on a horse, according to CGP Grey, right? It's so much more expensive. It's a logistical nightmare. So that's reason number one. Reason number two is that it's the first war of the transition between kingdoms and states. Because not every is statehood. Some countries are digging in their heels and they're saying that they're still kingdoms. They're still going to operate according to the old principles. And so it's the first war that really pits feudalism versus the newer economies of proto-capitalism to early capitalism. And it's tremendously expensive because not only do you have two different countries fighting, you have two different systems fighting. You have two different methods of understanding how the world should work fighting. And so it's really expensive. Now, it's a war that involves, at some stage, all of the countries in Europe, and it gets started over a diplomatic dynastic dispute in like central Germany. Not really relevant. What matters, though, is that the two big players are England and France. England representing the states and France representing the old style kingdoms. Keep in mind, France refers to itself still as l'ancien régime, the old state, the old kingdom, if you will. England, having finished its revolution, having these new sort of enlightened ideas about how states should work, represents sort of the new wave of systems. Functionally speaking, this war is a stalemate. this war ends up being a complete stalemate because at the end of the day, you don't really accomplish much. But it ends up bankrupting both France and England. So it doesn't really matter who won. England technically wins, but all they really win is a whole bunch of land in the colonies. Like they win parts of what's now Pennsylvania and the Ohio Valley, but not a ton considering how much was spent. And that's the thing. We saw this in the very first class. If gun to your head, what would you rather have, land or money? A smart person always says money because money can buy everything. It's an investment. It's not fungible. And so, France, the 7 Years' War broke. Completely broke. No money. Now, if you are England, of course, you're going to approach solving your I don't have money problem by raising taxes. By raising taxes on your colonies. That's why you have them, right? Think of it like old mercantilist system. I have created colonies. I have not created colonies because I'm a nice guy. I have created colonies because I want money, because that's how I'm going to make a lot of money really quickly. And so if I need more cash, I'm going to raise taxes on the colonies. And in the 13 colonies, the states that are going to end up forming the United States, this hurts particularly hard because of all of the colonies that England has, apart from maybe a couple in the Caribbean, this is their biggest colony. This is their crown jewel, if you will, the 13 colonies. And it's also their biggest moneymaker because the biggest cities are there. The biggest shipping centers are there. The biggest routes for things like furs and cotton and all of these things are there. And also the biggest market for their goods. Keep in mind, it's the Americans that are drinking a lot of things like tea or using British textiles or paper and stuff like that. And so King George III of England begins to increasingly tax the colonies. Now, you start to see pushback here. And you start to see pushback because of these Enlightenment ideas essentially claiming that maybe it shouldn't be this way in society. And we sort of study people in society, a science in looking at, what are the things that make society work the best? What is the best system of government? You start getting slogans. You start saying, well, the British system is kind of inefficient and it's kind of unfair, and this, big sort of policy idea gets synthesized down into what we now know as no representation. If you're going to treat us like citizens, give us the rights of citizens. Otherwise, leave us alone. And you start seeing this protest against, really mundane stuff. This should be a textbook example for things that happen even nowadays. Big protests, big revolutions happen over mundane issues. Whether it's, for example, the Yellow Jackets in France talking about the price of gas. That's a household issue. The Syrian revolution happens, starts out over people getting mad about the price of eggs. That's how it starts. The American Revolution starts of in order to, the big one being the Stamp Act, which essentially puts a tax on not stamps, not postage stamps, although that too, but anything printed. The printing press means that now everything is printed. And so, in an era pre-internet, think about how much that's actually raising in terms of taxes. If you have to pay, let's say, a nickel for every sheet of paper that you use, that's a lot of money over time. You're paying that in quantity. So the anger and the frustration of the colonial American public really starts to show in the form of revolutionary activity. Now, I don't want to get into the details of the American Revolution, and there's a couple of reasons for that. The big one being that this isn't an American history class. We're looking at the process. We're not looking at the events. Plus, this is the United States. We're at an American college. This is stuff you should know by now. I hope that you know what the American Revolution was about. But what I want to talk about, what I find fascinating about the American Revolution, is that we need to sort of define our terms, right? We've talked about revolution a couple of times. We talked about reformations and scientific revolution, but what exactly is a revolution? Like when we talk about the idea of a revolution, what is that? Now, for our purposes, I want you guys to think of revolution as not so much changing the ideas a change in the structures, economic structures of society, in not just so much how things are made, but how societies, how the power and the wealth and the resources in society are distributed and who gets to, quote, play the game, end quote. A reformation is more the ideological stuff. So, for example, Protestant Reformation is a big ideological change in the revolution. In the theology of Europe, right? A big change about, like, say, the role of the church or the role faith has in your everyday life. Great, that's a reformation. A revolution changes the structures of. If you're for this, think of it as a game of checkers. In a game of checkers, a reformation changes the rules of that game. A revolution changes the players, who gets to play. It changes the core sort of structure of what is this game about and who is it played between. Now, bearing that in mind, thought experiment with me. And I'm aware that I'm a little bit of a delay here, so I'm going to wait a second. But I see 20 of you watching. So I want 20 comments. I want you to close your before eyes. I want you to find for me. What do they look like? What sort of person are they? All right? Close your eyes. Write it. I'm going to be watching the chat. This might fail miserably, by the way. Let's see what happens. Come on. Can you repeat the question? The video buffered. Okay. I want you to think of an American colonial governor. And, like prior to the revolution, who's in charge of the Americas? Like these colonial governors, not so much like names, but who are they? What kind of people are they? What do they look like? What do they, how do they make their money? Stuff like that. Let me see what you guys have to say. Again, this could fail miserably, but the first answer is they're attractive, obviously. No, not necessarily. Alicia and Kayla have it right. Yes, and Warda. The dudes in the white wigs, the old, rich, white British guys, right? White chops, more than a little racist, yes. Old white guys, right? That's the answer, right? Think. Do you remember the Pirates of the Caribbean movies? The first one was good, and then the other ones were garbage. The dad in that movie, that's what I'm thinking of, right? You're talking about rich, white, they're landowning men. They own large swaths of land, large plantations. And because of that, they're also slave-owning men. So rich, white, landowning, slave-owning men. Can anyone describe the founding fathers for me? I'll wait. That's the thing. With the exception of Ben and Sam Adams, who lived in the cities, every other founding father was part of the same group of people. Thomas Jefferson, for example, forget whitewash that part of our history, but don't forget, like Jefferson's core promise when he ran for president later on was that every family in America could own a slave. That's his campaign promise. His promise is that all of you farmers can achieve the same level of wealth that I have. This is not a revolution. It's the same group of people in charge. I wish we had better study of the Constitution, because the first Constitution, before its amendment in the 1820s, limits who can vote to white men with wealth. There is a voting tax that basically disenfranchises anyone who can't afford it. If you can't afford to pay the tax, you can't. What? Only rich people voted. And because you needed to be man, rich people in the 1700s tended to be the same group. So remember what I said about a revolution changing the players, about who gets to play the game? This doesn't meet that standard. This doesn't do that. All it does is that it says, instead of your rich, but the group in charge does not change. It's our this is, by the way, the core premise of the Barrington Moore reading that you had to do for today. Barrington Moore's whole premise really is to argue that the American system was really modeled after the European feudal society, that window graph that I gave you. In America, it's slightly think about it. You have large swaths of landowning people, different, roughly usually, but own the land upon which other people work, and the fruits of their labor is given to the person who owns the land. The concept is the same, right? Now, the difference really between slavery and feudalism is the horror and the methodology of it. But in terms of economic process, they're not that dissimilar. They're not that different. And Barrington Moore takes it a step further and says that the plantation owning class of the Americas was the American nobility. That is what we talk about. When we talk about the nobles, quote unquote, in America, that's what we're talking about. America doesn't have nobles. It doesn't have like lords and ladies and barons and earls and all of that. What it have is large plantation classes. It has large groups of individuals who own lots of land upon which other people work, and they're gaining money from that. It's the same thing. Barrington Moore, in fact, calls this group of individuals landed elites. You know, elites that own land instead of owning wealth. You know, for those of you who have never watched it, I highly recommend it. Django Unchained. You know, think Leonardo DiCaprio's character in that movie, right? That's who we're talking about in this, you know, at this point in time. We're talking about that you know, Moore's argument is that is the who represents in society America's form of nobility. Now, America does have a revolution. It does, because we don't live in this sort of society anymore. We don't have large plantation owners anymore. We've gotten rid of those. But the American Revolution was not the American War of Independence, the Civil War. That is, according to Moore, you know, the American Revolution. Oh my God, I stand corrected. Let me put this back on and pretend that didn't happen. This is what we talk about. When we talk about the American Civil War, we are talking about in the structure of society, in how society from the ground. What the war does is that it eliminates the rural classes from being relevant. It eliminates slavery, who in our sort of window graph represent the rural and the rural rich, the landed elites, become functionally irrelevant. Think back to Amistad. You remember that scene in Amistad when Calhoun goes to the dinner with the president and sits down and says that if there is abolished, South will be completely economically? He's not wrong. The question is if that is that an slavery? I would have to argue, yeah. You know, and eliminating. So he's not as you're going to basically destroy the South economically. And, you know, that's sort of true. You sort of change already in the 1800s. So, for example, male suffrage is not in the first draft of the Constitution, but it is introduced the parentheses first president elected by the first universal white mayor. No, Jack. No, I don't know. But I just gem out. But yeah, you know, you start to see these changes in the electorate and in how the country is run. And then the American Civil War comes along, upends of shapes of the game and who gets to play. Power moves after the American Civil War from the plantations, southern gone with the world into the cities. You know, think about it. It makes sense that individual sort of aristocrats are the ones closest with the think of southern accent, that sort of genteel southern accent is not that different from a British accent. Think about how, you know, Kevin Spacey's character in House of Hawks, and his Oz and his own British accent, right? They're very similar. They're not that dissimilar, and there's a reason for that. Take it a step further. What is the drink of choice? It's tea. Not everything else. It's tea. By the way, that's it. Parentheses over. Now, power moves out of the plantations and into the cities. What powers in the 1800s, specifically the late 1800s, this period that we call the Gilded Age, we power shifting these sort of aristocratic classes and into the city. So here's now honor system. Take your phones, no Googling. One president between Grant and Teddy Roosevelt. Can you do it? I'm chat. Cool. Okay. What are your answers? Did I buffer again? Is that what happened? Did I? All right. One president, a single president, and Teddy Roosevelt. Thomas says, I couldn't tell you who was president before Bush. Great. I've been buffering off. Huh. See it fine here, but clearly it's because of I took off the hat. Magical. Most people can't name a president between, and the reason for that is particularly relevant. All right, can I tap? All right, let me do that. Okay, Woodrow Wilson is our first answer. No. Wrong, Roosevelt. Woodrow Ted. I asked him about Teddy Roosevelt. Good guess, though. But you can't do it, can you? President from that period of time. That's a chunk of 50 years that you cannot name a single president from. Honor system, right? That's not a coincidence, right? Not a coincidence, because these are the presidents that they don't matter, because in this period of American history, the president from this period, who Carnegie is, Stanford, right? You all know who these people are. That's a thing. That's not a coincidence, because that is where power lies in this period after the Civil War. And that's not going to change until the 1900s, really, until Teddy takes it back using the bully pulpit by force. No, well, not by force, but you know what I mean. Forcibly taking it back. But until then, that's not who's relevant. You have other people that are relevant in American politics and American life. Wow, way to make everyone feel bad. No, because it's not your fault, right? It is historically important to understand this. It's because it is, you can see history, where power went. Rockefeller's got 4 Manhattan city blocks named after him. That's how rich this guy was in Midtown Manhattan. That's who is right. That's who runs the country. So that's not going to change for a long time in this period, because power shifts out of the plantations, cities. For real this time. Like, the rural classes are not only, diminished, they're not relevant anymore. Culturally speaking, name one TV show that's set in the Deep South. Atlanta? I would consider Atlanta a big city. Apart from that, I can't. All right? Reason for that, culturally, economically, politically, it's relevant in terms of larger American society. If you want to our microphone and say, and now let's ask for the opinion of Mississippi, right? You ask Texas and California and New York, because that's where most Americans live, and those are the economic powerhouses of the country. Now, where am I going with this? See, Barrington Moore argues that this, through which, as a society, we have achieved what we would call modernity. Underline that question, underline that term, because that's in one of your questions. Barrington Moore says this is a route to what he would call the modern world, to modernity, the democratic capitalist in which the urban classes fight against the rural ones, Union versus Confederacy, in a violent outbreak of revolution, after which we achieve resembling modern society. And he says most Western countries achieve modernity in this way. England, parliamentarians. Parliamentarians live in the city. Royalists live in the countryside. As we're going to see in next week in France, nobles versus the bourgeois. Countries have achieved the modern world, have achieved modernity. There's 2 other ways. The first other one, so this is the first one. The second one is one in which the rural rich and the urban rich collude together and create a society that's favorable to their interests. Anyone guess what kind of society which the moneyed interests in the city and the moneyed interests in the countryside collude to form governments? And you so any guesses? What would you call that society? In and out of that, I don't know what's going on here. What would you call that government, that route to the modern world? I'll give you a hint. It happens Italy, Germany, Japan. These three places have in common: Italy, Germany, and Japan. Come on. Fascism. Yes, we got it. Fascism. For more, this is the fascist route to the modern world. It is a society in which the wealthy and protect violently against those who would try to reform society. The argument is the nobles get to keep their authoritarian form of government. Wealthy get why, for example, car in this period of Germany, Volkswagen, the people's car, BMW is right. These are companies that come out in Nazi Germany. Fiat, for example, is out of in Italian history. But Japan gives us the best example because most every Japanese brand, historic Japanese brand, comes from an old noble house. You know them as the samurai houses, joining the modern economy industry. Yamaha, Mitsubishi, Nissan, Honda, all of these things, these societies, companies, take the last name of the houses that had existed for generations. These noble houses of samurai, and they start making motorcycles. That is an example of a fascist route to the modern world. And the last route is the opposite of that, is where you have the poor classes fighting against the rich classes, and the poor classes win. And that's a common world, Rosh China. Now the argument, sorry, parentheses, option 4, which is funds and win, that's never happened. Like, Moore says that that's not an history. We've yet to see a sort of peasant / noble only society. It hasn't happened yet. But what Moore argues is that while these paths are ways as to the one that we live in terms of values, in terms of technological innovation, in terms of societal structures. The argument is democratic route, the fascist route, the communist route, that these societies are a great deal. Like if you to New York, from New York, and you fly to, let's say, Berlin, you fly to Hong Kong, you would be able to get by in all be completely alien to you. They'd be different, but they wouldn't be crazy different because they've all achieved modernity, even though the way they've achieved that is in different ways. So I hope that made sense. We've talked about a lot today, and we're probably going to recap it again on Monday. But, you know, shoot me an email if you have any questions. I'm sorry about the lag in places, or that's live stream itself, and that when this video goes up on YouTube, it should be fine. But we'll address it in class on Monday. Thank you for joining me for this. Thank you for taking the time. I'll see you guys next week. Enjoy the snow. Stop.